8. Underwater Military Museum. In a bid to attract tourists to the city of Aqaba, Jordanian authorities lowered 19 decommissioned military vehicles into the Red Sea in 2019. Arranged in a tactical formation along the coral reef, roughly 92 feet, 28 meters underwater, the collection consists of tanks, an ambulance, a military crane, a troop carrier, a combat helicopter, an anti-aircraft battery, and several guns. The project is the brainchild of the Aqaba Special Economic Zone Authority, which has turned to wreck diving as a way to attract visitors in recent years. The tradition of deliberately scuttling vehicles also stems from the Jordanian royal family's passion for diving, which goes back generations. In 1985, the late King Abdullah ordered the sinking of a Spanish cargo vessel called the Cedar Pride. An accident had blasted a hole in the ship 3 years earlier, leaving it a half-submerged eyesore, until the king decided to sink it to the sea bottom. An anti-aircraft tank became the second intentionally placed wreck off Aqaba in 1999. There are also a few sunken airplanes, a landing boat, and a crane barge. So if exploring waterlogged vehicles is your thing, Aqaba might be your type of place. 7. Esmeralda shipwreck. In 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama became the first European explorer to reach India by sea. 5 years later, during his second voyage to the subcontinent, his armada encountered a rough storm, causing a ship called the Esmeralda to sink in the Arabian Sea off the Omani island of Al-Halania. The Esmeralda was one of 2 ships that da Gama had left behind in the region to disrupt maritime trade between India and the Red Sea, according to a group of researchers who explored the wreck in recent years following its discovery in 1998. When it sank, it took its entire crew with it, including the captain, da Gama's uncle, Vincent Sodre. The wreck broke up in shallow waters, leaving behind very little of the actual ship, but the team that discovered the Esmeralda found a plethora of artifacts, including ancient firearms, stone cannonballs bearing Sodre's initials, and other weaponry, as well as the ship's bell, the oldest artifact of its kind ever found. They also uncovered a rare ghost coin called an Indio. Commissioned by King Manuel I of Portugal for trade with India after da Gama's first voyage, it's one of just 2 Indios that are known to exist. According to the researchers who carried out the expedition, the large amount of weapons found at the site reflects the brutally violent nature of da Gama's voyages, as the earliest known shipwreck from the European Age of Discovery, which predates other wrecks from the period by at least 50 years. The vessel also offers unprecedented insight into the violent and militant nature of early Portuguese seafaring expeditions. 6. Prehistoric Cemetery. While searching for the megalodon teeth along Florida's Gulf Coast near Venice in 2016, a diver discovered a barnacle-encrusted object that he didn't quite recognize. He was curious enough about it to keep it, only to later realize it was a human jawbone. The diver alerted the state's archaeology department to the discovery, and the artifact was handed over to Ryan Duggins, who immediately noticed wear and tear that isn't typically seen on modern teeth. Diggins visited the dive site with some colleagues, and it wasn't long before they found more human bones. Located roughly 300 yards, 274 meters from shore at a depth of 21 feet, 6.4 meters, the remains appeared to be from a prehistoric Native American cemetery. During the last ice age, Florida's coastline extended out much further than it does today. Rising sea levels caused the state to shrink considerably, submerging numerous ancient settlements that, until recently, experts assumed had been destroyed by the forces of the sea. Experts dated the burial site to around 7,000 years ago. At the time, hunter-gatherer tribes in Florida were just starting to settle down in more permanent villages. Duggins told National Geographic that he hoped the discovery would open researchers' minds to the possibility that there are more submerged prehistoric sites waiting to be discovered. Would you ever go deep-sea diving to explore ruins underwater? Tell us in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. USS Conestoga. Built in Maryland in the early 1900s, the 170-foot, 52 meters seagoing tugboat USS Conestoga was commissioned for Navy service during World War I. It departed from California's Mare Island for assigned duty in American Samoa on March 25, 1921, under the command of Lieutenant Ernest Larkin Jones. Neither the boat nor its 56 crew members were ever seen again. When the Conestoga failed to arrive at its destination in a timely fashion, the U.S. Coast Guard launched a massive air and sea search. It was the largest mission of its kind to ever occur until the search for Amelia Earhart in 1937. The only evidence of the vessel's fate that turned up was a lifeboat that was spotted hundreds of miles off course near Manzanillo, Mexico. Its whereabouts remained one of the Navy's biggest unsolved mysteries for nearly a century. In 2009, scientists from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration discovered an unidentified wreck sitting 200 feet, 61 meters underwater in the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. None of its features matched any of the region's known shipwrecks. It wasn't until 2016, 95 years after the Conestoga vanished, that the team was able to confirm with certainty that it was the long-lost tugboat in question. Based on its location, it's evident that the vessel sank within a day of leaving port. The wreck was found far from Hawaii or Mexico's Baja California coast, where it was long presumed to be located. Researchers pored over records and performed an in-depth analysis of the wreck's features before concluding that it was the Conestoga. Evidence at the wreck indicates that it ran into a problem with the barge it was towing when it disappeared, which also falls in line with the heavy seas and 40-mile-per-hour, 64.4-kilometer-per-hour winds that the region was experiencing that day. Experts don't think the actual towing issue caused the tug to sink. It appears as though the crew responded to the problem accordingly and tried to turn around and return to port. But as an older vessel, the Conestoga was prone to taking on water, and its location in an area notorious for its shipwrecks suggests that the crew was desperately trying to reach safer waters. The wreck is protected as a military grave and has found a new purpose as an artificial habitat for marine life. 4. Ancient megafauna. Until somewhat recently, at least in geological terms, the island of Madagascar was populated with massive animals that were multiple times larger than their modern-day relatives. In one of the most rapid extinction periods known to scientists, most of them have been wiped out of existence over the last millennium. The swift demise of these creatures coincided with the arrival of humans around 2,000 years ago, but the precise causes of the massive die-off are unclear. A discovery in 2014 marked a hopeful step toward finding answers when thousands of fossilized specimens were discovered in a series of submerged caves at Simanem-Pesotse National Park. Included among the initial finds were the bones of several extinct giant lemur species dating back between a few hundred and a few thousand years. The fossils included bones belonging to Archaeoindris, a giant lemur roughly the size of a modern-day gorilla, and the largest known species of its kind to ever exist. Collecting the evidence for further study was complicated, to put it mildly. Due to the complications of diving in the cave's dark, cramped confines, where the water is up to 130 feet, 39.6 meters deep. But the discoveries were well worth the effort and investment, and the team announced plans to hopefully make many more return visits and bring more bones to the surface for further study. 3. Centuries-old clothing. In 2014, a group of amateur divers found a silk dress among the wreckage of a ship that sank around 1650 off the Dutch island of Texel. They brought it to the surface along with a handful of other finds, including another dress, women's toiletries, and book covers. Little is known about the ship, nicknamed the Palmwood for the type of wood it was built from, including its real name. The discovery of the items has helped bring the wreck to life, prompting curiosity among both experts and the public alike about who was on the ship, where it was going, and who owned the clothing. Corina Hordijk, who directs the museum Kapskill, where the silk dress is on display, told the New York Times that its owner was likely the last person to touch it before its more recent discovery. She said that the dresses were made around 1620, about 30 years before the ship sank, and that they may have belonged to different owners. The silk dress was larger and was perhaps owned by an older woman, while the other dress, which is silver, may have been a wedding gown. Both pieces were extremely expensive and would have only been worn by rich people. It's rare for clothing to survive at the bottom of an ocean for hundreds of years, making discoveries like this extremely rare. In late 2022, a pair of pants found on a wreck called the SS Central America sold for $114,000 at auction. Thought to be an early pair of Levi Strauss jeans, the pants went down with the ship off the South Carolina coast during a hurricane in 1857. The pants were recovered from a chest belonging to a veteran of the Mexican-American War from Oregon named John Dement. He survived the sinking of the Central America, but his pants weren't so lucky. It's believed that he bought the clothing during a business trip to acquire goods for his family's mercantile shop. Interestingly, the wreck is famous for the hoard of treasure it took to the bottom of the ocean. But as the trousers prove, some of its most valuable artifacts are everyday items. 2. Industry shipwreck. Of the more than 4,000 estimated wrecks that sit at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, only one of them is a whaling vessel. Known as the Industry, the 64-foot-long, 19.5 meters vessel sank off the Louisiana coast during a sudden violent storm in 1836. The Industry was built in 1815 in Westport, Massachusetts. Manned by a 15-member crew, it operated as a whaling boat for 20 years before it met its demise during the squall, which ripped its two masts off and left the crew at the mercy of Mother Nature. Luckily, they managed to board lifeboats and were rescued by another vessel. What was left of the Industry drifted for 80 miles, 129 kilometers, before plummeting 6,000 feet, 1,829 meters, to the bottom of the sea. The wreck's location eluded experts until 2022, when scientists from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration spotted its anchors and the cauldrons that were used for rendering the whale blubber into oil. It had been spotted at least twice before, but it was only after the most recent discovery that researchers were able to confidently identify it as the Industry. The Gulf of Mexico is not known as a whaling region, but it once was. Scholars believe the first commercial whaling in the area may have occurred as early as 1760. Eventually, the region's whales were overhunted to the point where those who managed to avoid being killed were driven elsewhere. 1. One of the world's rarest coins. Eric Schmidt and his family were treasure hunting off Florida's Treasure Coast in 2015, when his metal detector alerted him to something sitting roughly 15 feet 4.6 meters underwater. For all he knew, it might be a piece of submerged garbage. But to his surprise, it turned out to be a 40-foot, 12.2 meters gold chain and a hoard of 52 gold coins from a fleet of Spanish galleons that wrecked 300 years earlier in 1715. This particular shipwreck, the Capitana, was among 11 vessels that sank in the region during a hurricane. It was en route from Cuba to Spain when it plunged to the bottom of the Atlantic, taking the Queen of Spain's jewels and 3.5 million pesos with it. The most valuable coin among the treasure trove was a single royal made for King Philip V of Spain. Nicknamed a tricentennial royal and dated 1715, the year the ship sank, it's thought to be worth up to $500,000. Some sources say that only a few dozen fleet-related royals have ever been found, and no more than a handful are thought to exist among the 1715 sunken fleet. The total value of the hull was estimated to be around $1 million, an arguably small fraction of the $400 million worth of treasure that went down with the ship, but a fascinating and impressive discovery in its own right. Schmidt and his family uncovered the cache of valuables on behalf of a company owned by Brent Brisbane, who owns exclusive salvage rights to the wreck. By law, the treasure belonged to the US government, but Brisbane and the Schmidts were rewarded generously for the discovery with a portion of the booty.
Number 9. Monel Forts Sealand. Great Britain's Thames and Mersey estuaries are home to a series of conspicuously out-of-place decaying towers known as the Monel Forts. Built in 1942, they were used by the British Army and Navy to protect vital shipping lanes from the Germans throughout World War II. The forts were built offshore and sunk into place. Each Navy fort was 7 stories and could accommodate up to 120 sailors, while the Army forts were constructed in groups in a futuristic architectural style and were often connected by walkways. After the war ended, the British no longer had any use for the Monel Forts, and they were abandoned in 1950. Several of the towers were occupied and repurposed by pirate radio broadcasters over the following decade, but most were eventually left behind and are unusable today due to their state of decay. One exception is the so-called Principality of Sealand, a self-proclaimed state that declared its independence in 1967 after its founder, Paddy Roy Bates, moved there to air his pirate radio station. Located off the Essex coast, roughly 7.5 miles from the nearest land, the fort was originally called HM Fort Ruffs. Sealand has its own hierarchy, flag, and currency. Most governments, including Great Britain, don't recognize its sovereignty, but nobody goes out of their way to interfere with it either. It consists of 2 towers which house a gym, a chapel, living quarters, and even a jail cell. Bates once held an invading German intruder in the jail cell for 3 months, releasing him only after a diplomat was sent to negotiate his return. At its peak during the 1970s, Sealand boasted around 50 residents. The fort remains under the care of Bates' son Michael, who lives there part-time, and as adult children are also actively involved in Sealand's day-to-day operations. Number 8. Indiana Army Ammunition Plant. As it started to seem increasingly likely that the United States would eventually enter World War II, the government began to mass-produce war material. In 1940, officials announced the construction of the world's first smokeless powder factory along the Ohio River near Charlestown, Indiana. By May of 1941, the sprawling facility consisted of 800 operational buildings spread out across 3 plants and employed over 27,000 workers, vastly outnumbering Charlestown's population of around 900 at the time. While many employees rented rooms in town by the shift or lived in one of the 17 trailer parks that were built to accommodate the sudden influx of new residents, high-ranking officials and their families lived in a newly built village called River Ridge, where they had access to a pool, community center, baseball diamond, basketball courts, playgrounds, and more. In addition to producing smokeless powder, the plant manufactured nitroglycerin, rocket propellant, and other explosive and projectiles. After the war, the majority of the workers were laid off while a skeleton crew continued to operate the facility. The factory was used on and off until the Gulf War, including during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, but production never reached World War II levels and officially ceased in 1992. More recently, cleanup efforts have worked to safely dispose of hazardous materials that were left behind when the factory was abandoned, and the government has started tearing the remaining structures down. Number 7. Lourdes Listening Station. During the early 1960s, the Soviet Union built an intelligence facility near Havana, Cuba, called the Lourdes Signal Intelligence or SIGINT Station. Located less than 100 miles from Key West, the 28-square-mile site was the largest Soviet facility of its kind outside Russia. At its peak, the station employed as many as 1,500 Soviet, Cuban, and Eastern Bloc technicians, engineers, and intelligence operatives. It was once capable of monitoring various forms of commercial and government communications throughout the southeastern U.S. and perhaps elsewhere in the country, as well as correspondence between America and Europe. But these capabilities eventually diminished when the vast majority of American telecommunications stopped traveling via microwave radio. In 2000, news reports claimed that China had struck a deal with Cuba to use part of the facility, but it closed down the following year when Russia could no longer afford the $200 subsidy it had given to Cuba every year since 1962 in exchange for use of the property. Then U.S. President George W. Bush took the decision as a reassuring indicator that the Cold War was over and that America and Russia were no longer adversaries although he may have been wrong about that last part. In 2014, the media reported that there were plans to reopen the spy base. Putin denied these claims, stating that he could meet Russia's defense needs without using the station. While there are no up-close images of the base, it certainly looks abandoned and overgrown in photos captured from afar. Number 6. Dole. Situated next to a nuclear power station north of Antwerp along the banks of Belgium's River Scheldt, Dole was once home to around 1,300 residents. Today, only 20 or so people remain as they fight to continue the town's 700-year history. Authorities condemned Dole in the 1970s to make room for the expansion of a port at Antwerp. Residents steadily moved out over the following years, with the majority of those left taking a voluntary payout in exchange for their cooperation during a renewed effort to empty the village during the 1990s. But a handful of people refused to leave, forcing the government to put its construction plans on hold. In the meantime, nearby building projects continued right up to Dole's perimeter, leaving it surrounded by factories, container docks, and other industrial fixtures. Demolition began in 2008, but was soon put to a halt when a court ruled against allowing authorities to kick people out of their homes. In recent years, the Flemish government altered its plans so that there's no longer a need to tear Dole down, marking an unlikely victory on behalf of average people who stood up against money and power. But the town's future remains uncertain. Officials don't seem too enthusiastic about the idea of repopulating the town to its former numbers, and its buildings are falling into a worsening state of decay from decades of neglect. But Dole's residents can at least rest assured that their homes won't be torn down. If the government ordered your town's residents to leave, would you be one of the few holdouts who fight and stay, or would you accept a payout and leave? Let us know in the comments below. Number 5. A dictator's isolated villa. For a 40-year period lasting from 1945 to 1985, dictator Enver Hoxha ruled over Albania with an iron fist, turning the country into one of the world's most isolated and politically repressive states. He spent the last 10 years of his reign ruling from the comfort of a luxurious 3-story villa that was located in the heart of the capital Tirana, yet closely guarded from the public. Hoxha died in 1985, and the villa has remained largely untouched ever since. It still contains all its original furnishings and artwork. Books still line shelves, vintage televisions and vases of fake flowers sit on glass and wooden tabletops, and even the floral patterned bedspreads look like they came straight out of the 1970s. Only top-ranking officials had any hope of catching a glimpse of the mansion, and it's remained under close guard and closed to the public ever since Hoxha's death. In recent years, photos have emerged showing the villa's spacious and sprawling interior, which includes an indoor pool, soundproof bedroom doors, and no shortage of rooms filled with elegant plush furniture, ornate light fixtures, and long, sweeping curtains that automatically draw a visitor's attention to how big each room is. In 2019, Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama told The Guardian that he isn't sure what to do with the opulent home. Considering Hoxha's legacy of human rights abuses, it's hard to say whether it's appropriate to destroy the house or preserve it for historical purpose at the risk of seeming like a shrine to a dictator. What do you think should happen to the villa? Let us know in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. E.J. Roy Building. Located in the heart of the commercial district in Liberia's capital city Monrovia, the Edward James Roy, or E.J. Roy Building, is in an obvious state of ruin. It's clear, just by looking at the crumbling structure, which has trees growing on parts of its rooftop, that it hasn't been used in years. Built in 1964, the high-rise functioned as the first official headquarters of Liberia's true Whig Party, which dominated the country's politics from 1878 to 1980. The building was named after Liberia's 5th president, who, like many other Liberian citizens, emigrated to the colony during a 19th century movement to relocate African Americans out of the United States. Roy borrowed punishing loans from the British for the development of badly needed infrastructure and defaulted on the payments, plunging Liberia into a financial crisis. He was ultimately overthrown, but was remembered as a hero among many who shared his political sentiments. During its heyday, the E.J. Roy Building housed a grand auditorium that was used for important meetings and conventions, but its glory days came to a screeching halt in 1980, when the indigenous factions of soldiers under the command of Master Sergeant Samuel Doe assassinated the country's president and staged a violent coup d'etat against the true Whig Party, bringing an end to its century-long rule. Doe became the new president, and the E.J. Roy Building was abandoned. It was handed over to a government agency, but fell into such disrepair that it was slated for reconstruction. Since then, it's remained at the center of a tug-of-war between the government and true Whig Party, who want to reclaim it as their headquarters. For now, it remains disused and in an ever-worsening state of decay as it languishes with an unknown future. Number 3. Kappa Astronomical Observatory. Before World War I, an Austro-Hungarian military fortress was built atop Mount Trebevic in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. Known as Bistrik Kula, its positioning offered an unobstructed view of the city of Sarajevo. After World War II, the fortress lost its military importance and was handed over to the Orion Astronomical Society during the 1960s. The group spent the next few years installing the latest technology at what eventually became the Kappa Observatory. It was the only facility of its kind when it opened in 1972, consisting of 3 domes for observation and a reference library and photo lab on the lower levels. The observatory also contained a fully stocked living quarters with enough supplies to accommodate a several-day stay. Sadly, the site was destroyed between 1992 and 1995 during the Bosnian War, and there wasn't enough money to replace the damaged equipment and buildings. The crumbling, disused structures still overlook Sarajevo today, representing a sad reminder of when the region's century-old tradition of studying the skies came to an end. Many people would like to see the observatory restored. Money is still an issue, but ongoing efforts to bring astronomy back to the country have gained some promising traction in recent years. Whether that means anything for Kappa remains to be seen. Number 2. Kelvin Hatch Nuclear Bunker. Built in Essex, England during the early 1950s as part of a bigger effort to improve Britain's air defense network, the Kelvin Hatch secret bunker initially functioned as an operations center for the London sector of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command. In the early 1960s, it became the regional government's designated headquarters for operating underground in event of a nuclear attack. The 3-story bunker's entrance is disguised by what looks like an ordinary house. Inside, there's an opening to a 100-yard tunnel leading 125 feet underground to the shelter's bottom floor. Like most British Cold War-era bunkers, Kelvin Hatch was equipped with its own electricity, water, and communication systems, and was capable of operating independently from the outside world. It could accommodate up to 600 occupants for up to 3 months at a time. The bunker was decommissioned during the early 1990s after the Soviet Union fell and the threat of nuclear war diminished. It was sold back to the family that owned the farmland that it was built on, which the government had acquired through eminent domain, and was renovated and reopened as a Cold War museum. Number 1. Batto Village. Deep in New Jersey's heavily forested Pine Barrens region is a perfectly preserved 18th century industrial ironworking settlement called Batto Village. Chosen for its bog ore and other natural resources, the site was established in 1766 by an ironmaster named Charles Reed, and it remained in operation for over a century. During the Revolutionary War, the facility produced iron for the Continental Army while evading detection by the British thanks to its remote location. Workers lived in homes built on the property, which also consisted of stables, a carriage house, a sawmill, a blacksmith, and other buildings. The owner of the ironworks lived in a nearby mansion that still stands today, and there was also a general store and a post office. When the demand for iron dropped in the mid-19th century, Batto was repurposed as a glass-making facility, but it wasn't very successful, and after its last owner died in 1909, the land was held in a trust until the state bought it in 1954. Batsto's population only decreased throughout the 20th century, with the last resident leaving in 1989. Over 40 of the property's original buildings have been restored, making a visit to the town feel like a literal step back in time. The local church, which was built in 1908, and the post office remain in use to this day. Thanks for watching. Which of these incredible abandoned places shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.